Hello and welcome to the video version of Technology in Space, located at technologyandspace.com. I speak with experts about space history, exploration, business, and commercialization. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for watching. I'm speaking with Dr. Barbara Scalvini, author of Aristotle from Antiquity to the Modern Era, published by GILES, February 23rd, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
It's a pleasure.
So first, how did you get into studying this subject and writing a book on
it? A bit by chance and a bit by training. I think that's quite common. I'm an antiquarian bookseller, and as it's common in the trade, we hardly ever specialize in one very specific field. We tend to cover a variety of fields, but then each antiquarian bookseller has their own, I suppose, pets. And one of my pets has always been the little scribbles and annotations that you find in the margins of printed books. Stuff that, you know, my own teacher would never, ever had permitted to me, but which in the 16th, 17th, 18th century were actually quite common. I like trying to understand those voices because the printed text is reproduced as many times as there are copies of the book. But those little annotations are unique to that copy. And I've always liked looking at those and drawing all the conclusions that I could. And so I guess that combined with my training in the classical languages, Latin and Greek, really kind of naturally drew me to take an interest in annotated Aristotle's. Aristotle is one of the most read authors in the history of humanity, and so there are quite a lot of annotated books of Aristotle. And then one day, Marty Gross, who had been a customer of Quaritch for several years before, came into the shop just as I was looking at a very special annotated Aristotle, and he wanted to know about it. I explained why I was growing very, very fond of that very new acquisition, and he absolutely clicked in with the potential interest, the potential relevance of this subject. And from then on, we started a partnership, a cooperation. Marty decided to collect specifically in this sector. A collection is really so much more interesting, I guess, if it's focused. And Marty's focus was sharp straight from the beginning. He moved from generally collecting philosophy and history of science to collecting specifically annotated Aristotle. And we've been working since together for about a decade. Until when Marty was invited to create an exhibition of his collection by the New York Historical Society, which is what's going to happen next September. And that's how the book was born.
Okay. All right, so tell me then, what does the book cover? I saw in the blurb, you know, it talks about how the ideas of Aristotle have been transmitted over time, you know, in this manner, or discussed and transmitted. So tell me what you describe in the book.
We wanted to convey the immense variety of the ways in which this body of thought has been transmitted to us. It's nothing that one set of writings will convey. All these objects tell so many different stories. There is the stories of the translations that have been made of the text of Aristotle. There's the story of the commentaries about it. There's the story of the university lectures, of the monastery copying out, of the sort of early scientist wrestling with a model of the universe that didn't quite match with modern science discoveries. So all these encounters between Aristotle and more modern readers produce almost like chemical reactions that are tangibly present in these, you know, very material objects. So that's what we try and cover. We try and cover the story of this handing down of this body of thought through physical artifacts that people can actually handle and without much risk, actually.
So does the book, is it sort of a reference of what exists, or how much does it discuss the thoughts of the people writing, in the margins?
It cannot be a reference of what exists.
Mm,
There is a body of reference on all the printed editions that have been produced of Aristotle's works throughout the world. And it's a really impressive tome with no pictures.
yeah.
What we wanted to do was a meaningful selection
Mhm,
of types, of genre, of cases, of instances. It was more the attempt to open windows into particular journeys that this text or these texts have made. It doesn't have any ambition to be complete by any chance. It's 40 books that I'm sure that at any point in the world one could make a census of thousands and thousands of annotated Aristotles. So the aim was not completion. The aim was really exemplification and bring things to life, trying to accentuate the specific importance of individual copies with individual annotations, not any copy of any edition.
mhm. So, so focusing both on what you include in the book and maybe also what you're aware of, um, how much, as far as what was annotated, how would you break it down between philosophers who did that, scientists, non-expert individuals? What do you see? What sort of trend?
I would say that 90% of these annotations were penned by very highly trained logicians and scientists. I mean, in the modern day, we identify the scientist with someone with a very specific aim in their research and a very specific method.
Mhm,
In the early modern era, to be a scientist and to be a philosopher was almost the same thing.
mm,
At the point of the birth of early modern science, the developing of a scientific method of thinking involves philosophy as well as science. So I think we see here profiles of university professors, of very highly trained clerical theologians and philosophers, very, very involved people in ethics, in logics, in physics, who try and really wrestle what they can from Aristotle and see how that matches up with what they experience in their own context, in their own culture.
mhm. Are these texts, do they simply go from person to person in a linear manner, or is there any, were they shared among people, and maybe others added notes to someone's notes, or is it just singular in a sense?
It's funny. It's always a different story.
Hmm,
Sometimes the book doesn't bear any evidence of any but one reader, and you can see that the handwriting that kind of changes through the ages. But and you can see this man reread
uh,
this book, 5 times in 20 years. And some other times you can see distinct sets of annotations made by one or the other. The thing is, as I said, now we disregard marginalia, but at the time there were thought to be improvements on the text.
hmm,
Uh, they could embody discussion, disagreement, diagrams, and so a new owner, a new reader would want to add their own set of thought next to what was already there.
mhm,
Yeah, the typology is just very varied.
mhm. Did you find instances where, and again, the focus on my questions is sort of the development and transmission of ideas, you know, to grow science. Did you see any instances where individuals wrote thoughts that maybe couldn't be shared for some reason? Maybe they crossed with religion or popular opinion. Did you see any hidden
hidden information. There was a really lovely, one of the lovely items that we have in the exhibition and in the book is actually written in microscript, unbelievably small. It was written at the end of 17th century, and the microscript is really smaller and smaller whenever the commentator has to contend with the difficulties of matching Aristotle up with the Copernican revolution. Up to Copernicus, well, Tycho Brahe and Copernicus, and then Galileo with his actual, observations of celestial phenomenon. The world believed, and Aristotle believed, that the Earth was at the center of this cosmos, and mankind, therefore, was at the center of this, the apex of creation. But then, with the Copernican revolution, really, these things begin to be questioned very seriously. How come, if the stars are fixed, how come we have comets? And so this man who records the actual passing of a comet in the 17th century does it in microscript, thinking, oh gosh, I'd better this quiet. It does disturb me. And what if someone opens my notebook? I left it on the table. I'd better write it freely to me.
I'm speaking with Barbara Scalvini, co-author of Aristotle, From Antiquity to the Modern Age. You can find more information about the book on the GILES website. If you like this episode of Technology and Space so far, please tap the like button and space dock the subscribe button. If you want more interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or to get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com. If you want interviews with military historians or daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want interviews with writers and creative people, or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. What languages are these texts in, and what languages are the notes in, the marginalia?
The great majority in Latin. That's because that's the language in which Aristotle was divulged for the greatest part in print as well. But actually we have many commentaries in, or actual notes, I'd rather say, the notes in the vernaculars, early modern languages. The main monument edition in the original Greek was printed in Venice by Aldus Manutius, the great humanist printer, between 1495 and 1498. Before that, and for a long time in a parallel way after that, Latin was the main language. So one has to contend with those difficulties, as well as the difficulty of the abbreviations of the scripts. Most words were abbreviated. Space is a very precious commodity in early books.
So which vernacular languages are we talking about?
Italian, French, English, some German, mostly, and Spanish.
Okay. And what about the, how often do you discover, or does the community discover new texts that maybe were hidden in attics or stored somewhere that people weren't aware of? Or has most of it been found and it's just circulating among collectors and museums and that sort of thing?
I'd say the sensibilities of collecting and of studying these artifacts changes in time. So 50 years ago, we wouldn't have paid attention to annotated books at all. So they would have roamed in the market, picked up by the odd nerd who would just go and want to read them. Now, I think that the academic community has really built up a consensus that all these little notes in the margins tell us so much about our history, that even librarians of great special collections go out of their way to collect them. And so these artifacts have always gone around. Now we are looking for them with a more specific intention. I have to say, Aristotle is so easy to find in annotated form because it was a school text. You wouldn't have gotten any degree without getting through Aristotle's logics and metaphysics at the very least. So they're not all of them rare. So with Marty Gross, what we've been trying to do is to really carefully select. Marty doesn't collect any old annotated Aristotle. We want for the annotations to be really quite special and meaningful and relevant and original, or at least exemplary.
What years does your collection, or what you focus on in the book, what time span does it cover?
Notionally, any arc. We don't really discard anything a priori, but I'd say the earliest artifact we have is from the 1250s. So it's a manuscript, entirely written in manuscript, mid 13th century. It's a very, very early commentary on the physics. It's very interesting to see a 13th century mind at work with the concept. And then we carry on into modernity. We tend to stop round about the end of the 18th century.
Can you repeat what you said about the 13th century thinker? You cut off there, and I wanted to get your thought that you were saying.
I was just remarking that it's very interesting to see the thoughts, see the annotations of a 13th century writer on notions of time and space. What is time? What is space? Can I describe them? Can I not? In what relation are they? So even a single leaf from the 13th century is a source of unending interest to us.
What about how this is sort of a little bit of a tangent. How about the ink or whatever they use to write in? Does it fade? Is it what's the quality of the writings?
As varied as we have copies, really, as it's very varied. I have to say, ink produced in the early modern era tends to stay. In the early 19th century, late 19th century, and early 20th century, there was this habit of gently washing books when they were very precious, because, as I said, people weren't really keen on annotations, so they would wash them and make them really, really faint, which is disappointment now when you see that. They still make them out. But it's hard. But a book that has not been treated, that's been just paradoxically neglected, will be as fresh as it was when it came out.
Are there what modern techniques are there to bring up writing that's faded or been washed away? Do you have imaging equipment that you use?
I have to say, in all the books I've handled, I've only ever used naked eye or a simple magnifying glass in the case of the microscript that I was mentioning earlier. I must say that the main difficulty is really the paleography, the reading of the script and the interpreting of the abbreviations rather than the fading of the ink.
Okay. What are you able to sort of discern any major jumps, with this span of time looking at the notes? Did you discern any major jumps in anything like thinking, approaches? You mentioned the Copernicus, the time of Copernicus, but how about anything else that jumps out as a big shift?
I'd say every time in history there has been a step up or sideways or backwards in logic, as well as physics. Logic has always been very influenced by Aristotle's thought, because Aristotle was the first one who conceived of concepts as being organized into categories, and for reasoning or correct reasoning to depend very much on the interactions that we make happen between these categories. So, for example, in the scholastic era in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, when very intricate logic was hammered out, that's when Aristotle came into play. That's when they discussed the ins and outs of his syllogism, the invention of syllogism. And again, when Leibniz, for example, decided that actually, what if we turned words into numbers, and we started a sort of logic applied to numbers and make calculations. So at that point, Leibniz really interrogated the structures underlying Aristotle's thought. And why not now? Artificial intelligence departments all over the world are still interrogating Aristotle's organization of logic for the construction of the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask how many of the notes were mathematical formulas versus, script. You sort of answered that there, but can you expand on it a little?
A lot of it is wordy as opposed to numbery. It's a lot more wordy than numbery, but a modern eye can see that a lot of this wordy bit only represents things that now are conceptualized in a numerical form. Logical structures might have been presented in diagrams with words, and now we would simply substitute numbers to those words. The book that Marty Gross fell in love with when he came to Quaritch, and that's how he started the collection, was full of diagrams. And that's probably what he found arresting. That book had been annotated in the margin. It was the commentary on Aristotle's physics. Well, not his physics, but one of his works on physics, and had been annotated by Galileo's teacher. And so to think that Galileo's teacher was drawing diagrams reflecting on, what we now call gravity, the weight, the fall, the speed, the acceleration. He was writing down diagrams and words, not numbers, but still considering these concepts very deeply and very likely passing them on to Galileo in the classroom.
Yeah, I'm not surprised he fell in love when he saw that. That's pretty awesome. So what about, do you see any shifts whatsoever when the printing press is starting to be used? Any shift in the types of books, the types of notes, the types of writing, anything?
With the introduction of the printing press, the corpus of Aristotle's work then becomes identified with a specific set of words that get reproduced edition after edition. Yes, of course, editions will vary slightly, but actually what the printing press achieved was the consolidation of the canon of his works, and also the simultaneous spread of this work across Europe at the time, and then across the Western world later on. Imagine being able to produce 2,000 copies of exactly the same thing within days, a feat that so many scribes would have had to achieve over months and months, with so many errors, so many mistakes, so many peculiarities.
In a sense, what you're describing has both pros and cons. The con being, it sounds like in the past, before the printing press, you might have more of a diversity of sort of expression of Aristotle's writings, whereas now it's sort of, as you said, it's sort of solidified into a structure where people might not try as much, higher level scientists, logicians, whatnot may dig deeper into what the words mean, but in a sense, you also might have a group of people who just see that as canon. Like that's what he said. You know, nothing else before is correct. You see what I'm saying? People get in a mindset.
Yes, I see what you mean, but I don't think that's necessarily what happened.
Mhm.
I think the sense of Aristotle being the philosopher, that's what he was called, you know, no one else, a philosopher. That sense was very, very ingrained throughout, you know, Western culture in the very early centuries, you know, from the Middle Ages, when printing press was just not available.
Mhm.
He was the authority. Challenging a text that was in manuscript form or in printed form was always going to be daunting. That really wasn't the case. And let's not forget that the annotations on the side are the case both in manuscripts and in the printed texts.
Mhm.
I would say the enterprise of printing these books, undertaken by the early printers who were very fine philologists, was an endeavor of purification. Imagine having even just a single page of text. You ask 100 of your friends to copy it out for you, or even taking dictation. By taking dictation from you, they are to write it down. You will end up very likely with 100 different things, all of which will have various mistakes. Some of them will be common, some of them will be unique. And so imagine this multiplied by the thousands of pages the corpus Aristotelicus implies. The endeavor of the printers, of the early printers, was to try and make sense of this multitude of versions by comparing them, understanding, oh, hang on, this must have been a mistake because actually this other section of the tradition of the manuscript collection does not have it, and it doesn't make much sense. So actually, the editing done by the printers has been a very, very precious improvement.
Hmm. Do you know if the printers, you know, early printers, were they scientists or did they engage scientists to help them figure this out?
Um, Again, they employed very highly trained academics. We know this for sure regarding Aldus Manutius, who employed the finest academics of his age. But we can't necessarily describe them as scientists the way we describe scientists these days. These people will have been super trained in their Latin, in their Greek, in their logic, and in their manipulation of this the quest of knowledge.
Mhm. Yeah, that's yeah. Scientist was probably the wrong term to use. I think you've described it better than I did as far as what I was trying to get at. So, what about differences within different texts that come from different European countries? Um, I think I sort of asked this question in a different form, but did you see any big differences? And again, I'm thinking in terms of religion, the effect religion had on what people could discuss and talk about and get into. Did you see any differences based on that nation or religion?
I was expecting, you know, pleased with my own, you know, history degree. I was expecting to see a more passive reception of Aristotle in Catholic countries and a more questioning attitude in Protestant countries, for example. But that was just not the case. I have to say, the material evidence really defies our construct and really reveals critical minds at work under any circumstances with a liberty that these days we possibly struggle to really guarantee each
Hmm.
other in our societies.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, and what would you say in your what you cover in the book? Who would who is the most obscure among those who wrote notes, and who's the most famous um, among the texts you cover?
the famous ones are easy because they are people like, Galileo's teacher. No one really remembers his name other than a few of us, Francesco Buonamici. But his role as Galileo's teacher really projects him on the VIP plan. And then we have a physician to a French king. Again, a physician to a French king commenting on the composition of colors is just a really interesting witness to read. And we have James Martin, a Scottish philosopher, whose writings have been completely, or not completely, but largely lost. And now here we have the notes that one of his students took at his lectures. So it's almost like hearing his voice. We have the texts of Robert Grosseteste, who was the first Chancellor of the University of Oxford. And then the little ones, the obscure ones, so obscure that we can't even name them, but we can glean from what they write. Oh, this might have been a Jesuit. Look at this little symbol that he writes here. Or this chap, probably from France, because the handwriting is very similar to, I don't know, 17th century, other examples of 17th century French writing. Many of them are anonymous, but by no means less vocal.
I'm speaking with Barbara Scalvini, co-author of Aristotle, From Antiquity to the Modern Age. You can find more information about the book on the GILES website. If you like this episode of Technology and Space so far, please tap the like button and space dock the subscribe button. If you want more interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or to get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com. If you want interviews with military historians or daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want interviews with writers and creative people, or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video.
So was there it sounds like there wasn't the habit of sometimes people say, write in their books property of. Did you have much of that?
Well, actually they did. Some of them did. And Francesco Buonamici, Galileo's teacher, did. And he did it on the title page, at the bottom of the title page. He wrote his name, but he wrote it in Greek characters. And so many years in the past few decades, no one had bothered spotting the Greek transliteration of Francesco Buonamici, and that's how we at Quaritch acquired it at auction, thinking, oh, that's interesting.
That is interesting. How about the use of, did you see much of the use of, how should I put it, sort of as with a note, an abbreviated note or full notes, question mark or exclamation point, like something like that, to express a thought about what they were writing, or
Absolutely.
underlines, or,
Absolutely. The typologies of all these additions, manuscript additions to an existing text, are so varied. You have manicures, which is like this little hand, the shape of a real hand like this, indicating a bit of text with underlining. And if you look at all the manicures, you basically will see what mattered to that reader and what didn't matter to that reader, which is almost as indicative, or if not exactly as indicative. There are ways of kind of drawing a line on the side and then writing in Latin, no, rubbish, or nonsense, things like that. And it really brings the voice to life.
Wow. So let me turn to how you did the research for this book. You've already described the steps you've taken to put it together. What else did you do that maybe you haven't mentioned to complete the book, the research for the book?
It's important to say that this book, very much like all this endeavor, has been a very, very close partnership. So Marty Gross, who is the collector behind this exhibition, his input, his questions, his personal research as a modern day man who's into science, his contribution has been absolutely major in all this. It's really is a book that's been written by several hands, and by no means the author, even if I do feature, but you know, it really isn't my book. It's something that's been born out of a conversation for about a decade. And Ben Morrison from the University of Princeton provides a really clarifying introduction and very vibrant and funny introduction to the general principles of the thought of Aristotle, because not many of us now bother to look it up.
What other, if someone were to pursue this sort of thing with another ancient or popular philosopher, who else out there has tons of work with notes and margins that people could get into?
No one.
No one?
No.
Okay. I thought maybe I was thinking perhaps Plato, and I don't mean just sciences. I was thinking maybe Plato, but
you know, it's my passion, and there was nothing I wanted more than having a twin thing, Aristotle and Plato, because you know that there's this saying around that the whole of history of philosophy is only a commentary on the works of Aristotle and Plato. Now, I don't think I subscribe to that entirely, but I kind of assumed, again, in my preconceptions, that Plato would have been as debated as Aristotle was. And he was conceptually, but interestingly, not materially, not nearly, not by a factor of, you know, not a tenth, not a 20th, not a 100th, I would say. There isn't another Plato exhibition.
Interesting. So what part of this whole process putting the book together, what part was most enjoyable for you?
It's always when a book I've ordered arrives and I open it and I start, maybe after 5-6 hours, when the familiarity with the hand kicks in, and I begin to read without having to, you know, struggle and curse at every step. When that voice comes to life and I can almost imagine that person, it's a very private sort of satisfaction. And then the other part is the sharing. I can't wait for these books to be actually exhibited.
What are some of the steps you take to protect these old books when you get them? You know, what you know, that's a book, an antiquarian question there for you.
You'll be surprised at how sturdy these artifacts are. You have to really want to damage them. If you want to damage them, you know, so long as your rooms are reasonably, you know, safe from big major humidity or major dryness, there is almost nothing that will damage these books. They were made to be handled, and they were made to last centuries.
What materials are they made of? I guess I can assume that, but what describes sort of the material?
So that for the most part, they're made of paper, and paper made out of rags. So early paper was made out of rags. It's a very good quality paper. It will last. Some of them, like the 13th century leaf that I described earlier, was made out of vellum, which is animal skin treated to absolute thinness and whiteness through a very lengthy process. But I mean, if you reflect that in order to have this size page out of vellum, you might have needed a whole sheep by the time you cut out all the legs bits and the things that you can't use.
Mm-hmm.
You need a whole sheep just to get this size leaf.
Mm-hmm.
You will really see that every single millimeter had to be exploited.
Mm-hmm.
Something.
How about the covers of the book and the binding? What was used?
Again, bindings can vary. Some of them are vellum. Some of them are other animal skin that has been treated and then used to cover boards, wood boards or cardboard boards. And on top of this animal's skin, which could be calf is one of the most used materials, there will be decorations that might be gilt coats of arms or gilt little ornaments, or simply kind of blind stamped, blind tooled little ornaments. It may not be familiar as a concept, but when you went to buy a book in the early modern era, you wouldn't buy it with its binding. You would only buy the pages, block of pages, and then you would take the pages to your own binder, favorite binder, and tell him, can you please bind this quite cheaply for me? And so he would wrap it up in vellum. Or could you please bind this in really nice, expensive Morocco with my gilt coat of arms on top? And so it would be done on spec. So no bindings of the same work are the same. Very few bindings of the same work are actually the same.
And I would hope then the pages are numbered so that your binder doesn't mix up pages, or no?
Not necessarily, no. What happened was that the printer would print quires, which is like a group of pages, the group of pages that can be obtained by folding a single sheet. Single large sheet of paper, then you fold it once, you fold it again, and you fold it again. And you open it up, you print all your pages on top of that, and you fold, and then you cut it around. And you will have gotten, 8 leaves typically, or 16 pages. And then the printer might have put a little number, or a little letter, A, B, C, etc., to mark number of quire, so that the binder would know what to bind next. They often made mistakes. So sometimes you go, oh, oops, I'm missing quire B, only to find that it's been bound at the end, so it was there all along.
What about, so I'm thinking about the fact that sometimes some of these thinkers were engaged in what we might call magic or alchemy, or some of those sort of esoteric arts mixed with science. Did you find much of that in any of the books? Anything like that in the margins?
Not much. No. Not much. But I mean, I'm a very hungry searcher, so who knows? Maybe we will. I suspect Aristotle doesn't really lend himself too much, at least what is now established to have been Aristotle. There have been slightly esoteric works that have been attributed to him in the past, but since the 19th century have been really taken out of the corpus. As far as Aristotle is concerned, usually you really have in front of you a logical, scientific mind.
Okay. What in this work for this book most surprised you? What did you come across that most surprised you?
I guess the sheer abundance. I genuinely didn't know when I set out that I would have to sift through hundreds of things, and I would have been spoiled for choice, really. The abundance, and in a way, the universality. If I'd been an Italian Aristotelian scholar in the 16th century, instead of being an Italian in the 21st century, I would have been able to travel the known world and have had a meaningful discussion and being able to understand any counterpart in Oxford, in Paris, in Leipzig, in Coimbra, in Rome, in a way that is so cosmopolitan, I guess. Yeah, I guess the sheer cosmopolitan exuberance of Aristotelianism.
Okay. Were there any of these individuals, did they have multiple texts of Aristotle, or is it most of them had their one text and that's what they worked with? Any ideas?
I'd say if you looking at the notes, you can see that many cross-reference what they read with other works that they clearly had at their disposal, because they were making the cross-references in the margins. And so you can tell that most of them were able to rely on quite well-furnished libraries, perhaps not in the privacy of their own home, but if they were affiliated with a university or with a monastery or with a large foundation, they would have had access to several of Aristotle's works, and not just Aristotle, but quite a lot of work from antiquity.
Did any of the books that you list or have in your book, did they come from, as you mentioned, library collections or any collections that would have been open to a wider group of people?
Many of them have a very early monastic provenance. So, and that's how one explains the presence of multiple annotators. You know, in the 18th century, the dissolution of many monasteries around Europe led to the dispersal of many of these monastic libraries that were considered, you know, pretty standard, because they were. And so these books are now in circulation, but they do bear witness to a whole community reading the same copy of the same book.
Can you remind me up to what's the most recent date? The book with the most recent date, what date is that? What year about?
We have up until the early 18th century.
Early 18th. Okay. Because I was going to ask if there were any of these books, if they had American commentators in there.
You know, I worked once on a parallel project, not parallel project, it was a different project, trying to find as many copies as possible of books that had belonged to Thomas Jefferson. This search for Aristotle in the libraries of the founding fathers, especially founding fathers who did have a sensibility for the classics, and who did have open accounts with many European booksellers, it's very difficult to pinpoint specific copies of specific Aristotle's works. You will find plenty of references to Aristotle in many of the founding fathers' writers. And one of my projects for the future is to hunt them down. But what is difficult in that instance is to match them up with material evidence of it. So I suspect most of these quotes were secondary. They were quoted from other works, you know, synthesis or, you know, general compendia of ancient philosophy. But I don't want to speak too early, because that's one of the directions I would love to explore.
What was there a particular, and obviously there are going to be all kinds of gaps in information that you have access to, but was there a particular question, as you put this book together, a particular question that you really wanted to get an answer for and did, or maybe it's still something you'd really like to know or understand?
I think the outstanding question is how, it's almost like a chemical reaction. What was the reaction between this text and this person and their context? I guess it's a historical interest rather than theoretical interest.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, in theoretical terms, in many fields of our knowledge, have really acquired a distilled notion of what Aristotle thought. What we haven't really acquired yet is a sense of how we got here. And so I guess the outstanding question is that, how have we got here? What did that particular handing down of this message imply? What changes did it bring to the message? What new light did it throw? And that's a question that is refreshed at every instance.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any texts that seem to have notes from sort of generations, like, from, passed down to children over and over?
Only one, and it's the one I mentioned, the physician to the King of France, who passed it down to his son, who was a noted humanist, and both sets of annotations survive. The others, I guess, in the monastic reality, you just really don't have offspring. You pass it down to the next students.
Mm-hmm. Were any of the commentators women?
No.
None? Okay. So apart from your book, like even in the wider realm, you haven't come across any female?
I suppose some of the anonymous ones might still turn out to have been women. There is nothing in those notes that suggests anything regarding the gender. I suppose that's what I'm saying. There's nothing that suggests that they might have been women as opposed to men. Would it have mattered? I doubt it. It really was always about the thought. It would be lovely to see that, or to find out one day that one of these were women.
Okay. Was there anything in your research or the work for this book that had a strong emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
I think when the annotators write in the margins, "Oh, reader, spare a thought for my soul," that's a little aside, and it doesn't really matter, does it? Because it's not about the text. But it really tells me, wow, this guy really counted on someone reading this way down in time, way down the centuries. He almost counted on me sparing a thought for his soul at this point. And I confess I always take time to send up prayer.
Huh. Interesting. Actually, that makes me think about, it's always interesting to think about the age of these books and how many generations, nowadays the books we have, you look at your book, it's maybe 10, 20, maybe 50 years old, maybe 100. But these texts have lasted for so long. It's amazing to think how many hands they've been through. I don't know if you want to comment on that. That's just sort of an aside.
I think it's a part of what draws all antiquarian booksellers to this job, really, is this sense of thrill of being part of this material handing down. I don't own books. I don't have them. I don't buy them. I just I find it incredibly fulfilling to find them and match them up with their next owner, and cover this little part in the history of this book by simply being a convector. It is quite emotionally intense to feel that you're part in the story.
At what point in time did you have antiquarian booksellers maybe logging the the ownership, the line of ownership of important books, or anyone, in fact, not just booksellers, but where did people start keeping track of that,
When did people start collecting books, you
or
mean?
keeping track of this book owned by and then sold to and owned by, what, sort of a line of provenance? Is that the right word?
Yeah. I guess an attention to provenance of books that are dear to the owner has always been the case. Always been the case. You find it in in 15th century books. People note how much they paid for this book, where they bought it, on the fair in Frankfurt, and I paid. So there is a self-conscious sense of ownership from very early on. And now all this attention to the material history of the readership really has brought to the birth of very sophisticated websites that allow you to track the passages of ownership for the most important books. And that clearly the idea is to extend this as much as possible to all books printed in the 15th and 16th century.
How extensive are the details of books? Like, does it get, I imagine it gets down to number of pages and sort of a physical description, just to make sure the book is, what is described, because I imagine some people might try to forge or create, fake copies.
Yes, we have that. We do. It doesn't do much good to the trade, does it, to know that there is forgery. On the other hand, the Association of Antiquarian Book Dealers is a worldwide organization that does a lot of quality assurance work. All the descriptions written by members of the association have to be quite meticulous. And when you buy a book from any member of this association, the physical description has a fact, is like a contract. This is what you're buying. If it turns out to be, you'll get your money back.
Wow. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but wow, I can imagine that's a lot of work.
Yes, but it's good work. It's fun.
Yeah, but I guess now you can just take pictures of like every page and every angle of the book, and that's helpful, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, you have to be realistic and quite economical. You mustn't kind of be led astray by this worship of the page. Many antiquarian books are worth maybe $200-300, and I mean, here at Quaritch we deal with a very, very large range of value. I can't really spend many hours looking through every single minute detail of a very cheap book. Otherwise, but for important books, when the interest is there, and especially when it's important for future reference that a peculiarity should be recorded, then Quaritch, we've been here since the mid-19th century, and our descriptions are still quoted in library catalogs.
Cool. So you've already mentioned a little bit about your goals for the book. What else would you like the book to do for readers?
I'd like for the book to make the readers curious. I'd like for the book to be just exactly the opening of a window, the beginning of a journey, I'd say the little prompt that will inspire them to look at books physically in a different way, and really, if possible, go and spend time with your local bookseller. They have the most fantastic stories to tell.
What could scientists, like modern scientists, people working on the space program and interested in astronomy and all this stuff, what do you think they can take away from your book?
I guess from a scientist perspective, I think it's important to mature the awareness that the way they ask themselves question is historical. It comes from somewhere. There may be another way, to ask themselves a question. So I guess what you get from the book is a prompt to questioning yourself. Why am I framing my inquiry in these words?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, I do that because it's been handed down to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I received it that way. Would there be another way of framing it? So I guess, like many other messages from the past, it's just really a check on your own critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I certainly think that as well. I mean, that's why I'm interviewing you about this topic for a technology podcast. Were there any difficulties in getting the book finished or published?
No. I mean, this happened in the times of COVID, but very, seamlessly. I have to say, Marty Gross and Michael Ryan of the New York Historical Society really bent over backwards to make it happen. A great photographer was able to do stellar work in somewhat reduced circumstances. So no, it's been a thoroughly enjoyable experience.
Sure. If you want to show some pictures from the book, you can go ahead, show viewers. Listeners won't be able to see it, but viewers can see any of the things.
I think this image
mm-hmm.
is perhaps one of the most telling, because it shows you the variety of annotation. It could be interlinear in between the lines. It could be marginal, and within the marginal there would be different sizes, different in a way kind of hues of color, and a few diagram like things in the middle, just to show that in the way that a modern web page is designed to get the eye to identify immediately what level of interpretation you are offering, what type of information you're offering, this annotator was doing the same, so this is where I do this is where I do that, and this is where I ask my questions, and these are the chapters. So in a way, a very visually efficient way of communicating.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some of your future projects. What are you working on currently?
As a book dealer, I just, with my colleagues, we are trying to run the business in the COVID time. At the moment, we are concentrating on early books and English literature. We have a long-standing tradition of selling good English literature. Mm-hmm. Myself, personally, I am still completely committed to annotated books, and especially annotated books of the 16th century, the thought of the Renaissance. And so all my colleagues know that that is my turf. They very generously give it up to me. And with the Marty Gross Foundation, I hope to cooperate again in the future for similar projects. The foundation has worked really to convey the relevance of the thought of ancient philosophy into the present, and that's so very much in line with my passion.
Okay. Where can people find updates on your work or your thoughts, anything you're working on?
I guess email. I'm not very good at social media at the moment, quite overwhelmed, but Bernard Quaritch, the business I work for, we are open 5 days a week, and I work there. So we welcome any friend, any contributor.
How do you spell the name of the shop?
Bernard Quaritch, and it's Quaritch.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
He was a 19th century German who came to work in London and founded one of the biggest antiquarian booksellers.
Nice. Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
No, just I am really looking forward in anticipation to the day when we open the exhibition next September at the New York Historical Society. And I really hope that people who have not heard of Aristotle before, or just heard of him really in passing, would not be put off. It's the whole point is to approach the general public with the thought of this amazing, amazing thinker.
Mm-hmm. And so the exhibit will be September 2021 is the plan?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
In the next episode, I speak with Cesare Barberi about the search for extraterrestrial life. Dock the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Technology in Space. If you like the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more books and information on space history or the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Thank you for watching.